Everyone refused to bond with the blind Apache chief's daughter until this cowboy accidentally. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The main street of Red Rock Ridge was little more than a wide trail beaten hard by wagon wheels and horse hooves. Dust drifted in low clouds with every step. A line of tired buildings stood against the wind. Saloon, livery, trading post, blacksmith shed, all marked by fading paint and cracked wood. On that morning, 1881, the town had gathered for something that felt halfway between business and spectacle. At the center of the street stood a young woman. She was the daughter of a once feared Apache chief, though here she was treated as nothing but a trade. Her bronze skin carried faint scars from old hardships, her long black hair falling loose down her back, catching in the breeze. Her eyes were clouded, pale gray, blind yet strangely steady. She wore a deerskin dress that had been torn at the neckline and hem, offering glimpses she did not choose to reveal. The townsfolk saw weakness, shame, and something to mock. They had been told she was to be bonded, sold, bartered, however one chose to put it. Men from the town gathered, curious but not willing. A few shuffled their boots, muttering that blindness was a curse. Others laughed outright, saying no man wanted the burden of leading a woman who could not see. One woman standing by the mercantile spat in the dust near the Apache girl's feet. The girl heard it, stiffened, but kept her chin lifted. She refused to fold even as voices rose against her. Cole Merrick had not come for this. He had ridden in from his ranch a dozen miles out to the north. His horse needed shoes, and his stores had run low. Coffee, salt, flour, nails, that was his purpose. He had no thought of taking anything else home, least of all another mouth to feed. At 38, Cole was known in town, but barely spoken to. He carried the look of a man carved out by weather and grief. His frame was tall and broad from years of ranch work, his face cut by lines of sun and loss, a pale scar dragging along his jaw. His blue eyes rarely met anyone else's. People remembered he had once had a wife, but she died years back. Since then, he kept to himself. He ran cattle, kept fences mended, and spoke little. When he rode down the street that morning, he only meant to pass through. But the noise drew his horse to a stop. He looked once at the crowd, then at the woman standing still in the dust. She had no one at her side, no hand to guide her. Her chin remained high, though her dress was torn and her dignity tested. The sight stirred something in him, though he didn't understand what. He told himself to move on. He had no room for this, no desire for it. He tugged the reins, meaning to steer away. But then the clerk at the trading post stepped out, waving papers. "Someone's got to take her," the man called. "Chief sent her. She's to be bound proper-like. Somebody sign, else she'll rot where she stands." The crowd chuckled. No one stepped forward. Cole dismounted only to buy nails. He did not mean to be part of anything else. But as he moved past, someone shoved the paper toward him, making a joke of it. His silence stretched too long, his hand half raised. The clerk pushed harder, saying, "All it takes is your mark, cowboy. Don't leave her standing here." Cole should have said no. He felt it heavy in his chest, the same heaviness that came every time someone pressed on him more than he liked. But grief and weariness made him slow. The paper slid across, his mark scrawled before he realized he had given it. By the time he looked up, the crowd had fallen quiet, then broke into laughter. "Well, Merrick's gone and done it," one man sneered. "Blind squaws now." Cole didn't answer. He had learned long ago that silence shut men up quicker than argument. He gathered the paper, folded it into his coat. He turned his eyes once more toward the woman. She hadn't moved. She seemed to know the change without being told. Her heart was pounding though her face gave nothing away. She had been waiting for rejection. Each sound of laughter had been another cut. When a man with the scar on his jaw touched her wrist, she startled but did not pull back. She had braced herself for the moment she would be cast aside again. Instead, he lifted her arm and guided her toward his horse. Cole felt the bone lightness of her wrist, the warmth of her skin against his calloused hand. He said nothing as he swung into the saddle. For a second he hesitated, reins loose in his hand. It would have been easy to leave her there despite the paper. But when he looked at her standing in the dirt, blind eyes unfocused yet unbroken, something in him refused to turn away. "Come on," he muttered low, rough with unease. He reached down, wrapped his arm around her waist, and lifted her up behind him. She settled quietly, her hand gripping the back of his coat. The crowd jeered again, but Cole only pressed his heels to his horse and rode on. Behind him, Red Rock Ridge shrank into dust and distance. Ahead, miles of open land waited, and beyond it his ranch, a weather-beaten house, empty since his wife's death, a place of silence he had grown used to. He wondered what it would mean to bring her there. He told himself it was only by chance, a mistake of papers and hesitation. But as he felt the faint weight of her hand holding to him, he knew there was no undoing it. She was his responsibility now, and though she did not speak, the woman understood the same truth. She was not left in the street. She was not cast away. Her fate, for better or worse, was tied to the quiet cowboy who had not meant to claim her. The horse carried them out into the wide land. Neither spoke. The sound of hooves on hard ground filled the silence, carrying both of them toward a life neither had planned, but neither could refuse. The road out of Red Rock Ridge stretched long and silent, only the steady rhythm of hooves breaking the air. Cole Merrick kept his eyes forward, the brim of his hat low, his jaw tight, as if holding back words that threatened but never came. The woman rode behind him, her arms lightly holding to his coat. He felt the contact more than he wanted to admit. She was careful not to cling, but every shift of her body reminded him she was there. The ride home was not short. His ranch lay near the foothills to the north, miles of grassland and broken fence line between. The late afternoon sun dropped behind thin clouds, painting the land in pale gray. By the time they reached the rise where his weather-beaten house came into view, the light had grown weak. The cabin sat small against the open expanse, wood walls leaning but still solid, smoke barely drifting from a chimney gone cold. Cole had not bothered to keep fire steady during his trips to town. He felt her straighten slightly when the horse slowed. She couldn't see the house, but she knew the rhythm of the ride had changed. Her blind eyes turned toward the air, as if trying to catch some detail others missed. "This your place?" she asked, her voice calm, though underneath it there was tension. Cole gave a short nod before remembering she could not see it. "Yes," he said gruffly. She didn't ask more. That unsettled him. Most women he remembered from town life would have demanded answers, explanations, assurances. She gave none of that. When they reached the porch, Cole swung down and held the reins firm. He hesitated before reaching for her. She waited, her hand still. He took her wrist again, steady but not rough, and helped her slide down. Her boots touched the ground, and she stood still, shoulders squared, refusing to lean on him more than needed. Inside the cabin, shadows clung to every corner. Cole lit a lantern, the small flame throwing weak light across the one-room home. A narrow bed pushed against the far wall, a stove set near the center, shelves cluttered with tools, tins, and a Bible left untouched for years. He caught her sniff the air faintly. Ash, sweat, leather, and dust. "This where you live?" she asked softly. "Yes," Cole answered. He felt a sudden need to explain, though he rarely explained himself. "It's enough." She tilted her head toward the sound of his voice. "It will do," she said simply, her words not mocking but firm. Cole busied himself with the stove, setting kindling, striking flint until a flame took. He wanted to ask her name, though the clerk in town had spoken it once, quick and in passing. He couldn't remember clearly. The thought made him feel careless. "What do they call you?" he asked finally. Her lips pressed together before she answered. "Ayoka." He repeated it once, quietly, as if testing it in the room. "Ayoka." She nodded faintly. "And you?" "Cole Merrick." Her blind eyes seemed to fix on the sound of his name. She said nothing more. He noticed then how torn her dress really was. The neckline had split enough to reveal the upper curve of her chest, fabric frayed at the edges. The hem hung ragged above her knees, beads and shells clinking faintly when she moved. He looked away quickly, guilt pressing into his chest. She had been mocked in town, and he didn't want her thinking he was another man staring at what she hadn't chosen to reveal. He took down bread left from the day before, cut thick slices, and set them on a plate. She moved toward the table carefully, one hand outstretched until she found the edge. He watched as her fingers traced the grain of the wood, then found the plate. She ate in silence, small and steady bites, as if she had gone too long without food and didn't trust there would be more later. Cole ate little. He couldn't stop thinking about how she had stood in the street while men jeered. He asked himself why he hadn't just walked away, why he had signed his name, why he had lifted her up instead of leaving her in the dust. He had lived years telling himself solitude was easier, that no one else needed to be caught in the weight of his grief. Yet here she was, sitting at his table, her clouded eyes focused on nothing but her presence filling the room in a way he hadn't expected. "You didn't choose this," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. His fork paused in his hand. "Neither did you," he answered. Her lips curved in something close to a bitter smile. "No." The truth sat heavy between them. Cole rose and pulled out the single blanket he owned that wasn't torn. He spread it across the bed, then paused. It was the only bed in the cabin. He thought about offering her the chair by the fire, but the image of her curled there blind and weary didn't sit right with him. "You take the bed," he said firmly. Her brows lifted slightly. "And you, the chair will do." She hesitated, then nodded. She slipped out of her torn shoes, set them neatly near the wall, and lowered herself onto the mattress. She did not lie down at first, only sat with her hands in her lap, as if listening for the sound of judgment. Cole turned his back, took the chair, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. In the quiet, he found his own thoughts harder to avoid. He thought of his wife's face, her laugh, the way she had sung softly while mending shirts. That memory had haunted him every night since she died. Now another woman lay in his bed, though not by his choice, not by hers either. He wondered if he was betraying his dead wife just by allowing it. He clenched his hands and told himself this was only circumstance, nothing more. But when he glanced back, he saw Ayoka finally lying down, her hair spread across the quilt, her blind eyes closed, her breathing steady. She looked smaller now, younger somehow, stripped of the pride she had worn in the street. Cole felt a strange pull in his chest. Not desire, not yet, but something closer to empathy. She had been cast off, unwanted, mocked. He knew what it was to be left alone in the world. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind pressed against the boards. Inside, the cabin felt less hollow than it had in years. Cole leaned back in the chair, still uneasy, but no longer entirely alone. He thought of the questions the townsfolk would ask if they saw her here. He thought of what it meant to have signed his name, to have her bound to him in a way he hadn't chosen. He thought of whether she would stay once she realized who he was, a broken rancher with nothing to offer but silence and hard ground. Yet when sleep finally pulled at his eyes, the sound of her quiet breathing filled the cabin like proof that leaving her behind had never been an option. Morning came gray and sharp over the hills. Cole Merrick stirred in the chair by the stove, his back stiff from the awkward sleep. He had never liked sleeping anywhere but his bed, but last night he had given it up without second thought. The steady rhythm of another person's breathing had filled the silence of the cabin, and though he'd hardly closed his eyes, the night had passed without the usual crushing loneliness. He blinked against the weak light, pushing himself up to his feet, the boards creaking beneath his boots. Ayoka was still lying in the bed, hair dark against the pillow, her blind eyes closed. She looked calm, but her hands were curled lightly, as if even in sleep she kept ready to defend herself. Cole stood a moment, unsure if he should wake her. He had lived alone so long he had forgotten the feeling of another body under his roof. He wasn't sure what rules should guide him now. Finally, he let her rest and stepped outside into the cold. The ranch spread wide under the dim sky, fences in need of repair, corrals half-leaning, and the barn weather-worn. His wife's grave lay at the back near the cottonwoods, a marker of what already beginning to fade with the years. Cole let his eyes rest there for a second, guilt stirring. He wondered what his dead wife would think of the blind woman now sleeping in her bed. He shook the thought off and busied himself with the water pump, filling a bucket. When he returned, Ayoko was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her blind eyes turned toward the sound of the door, alert, cautious. She hadn't spoken yet, and he realized she might not know if he meant for her to stay at all. He set the bucket down and cleared his throat. "There's water here," he said simply. She nodded faintly, feeling her way to the bucket. He noticed the way her hands moved, slow but sure, every step measured. She splashed water over her face and hands with practiced care. She did not ask him to help. Cole heated what was left of last night's bread and set on the table with coffee. She joined him, finding the chair by touch. He saw again how little she ate, taking small bites as if saving it for later. He frowned and finally spoke. "There's more food here. You don't need to hold back." Her blind eyes turned toward him, steady. "I've learned not to trust when it comes." He didn't know how to answer that. He only nodded once, pushing more bread toward her side of the table. When breakfast ended, Cole gathered tools to start on the fence line. He assumed she would stay inside, maybe rest, but as he stepped toward the door, he heard her stand. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Fences need mending. I can help." He stopped, surprised. "You can't see the posts." Her chin lifted slightly. "I can carry tools. I can listen for where you are." Cole studied her. Part of him wanted to refuse. The land was rough, the work demanding, and her blindness made everything harder. But she looked determined, and he had learned once that denying a person's will only bred bitterness. He gave a short nod. "All right, you carry the nails and hammer." She followed him outside, holding the handle of the pail with both hands. The air bit cold against their faces, wind pulling at her loose hair. She stumbled once on uneven ground. An instinct made Cole reach to steady her. His hand went to her arm, firm but gentle. She caught her balance and gave a small nod, not pulling away. They reached the broken stretch of fence where the posts leaned out of line. Cole set to work digging the old stakes free, his muscles straining. Ayoka knelt near, setting the tools where he called for them, finding her way by the sound of his voice. She held the boards steady as he hammered. Her hands pressed firm, those splinters caught her skin. She did not complain. Hours passed in hard labor. Cole caught himself watching her more than once. The way her head tilted, listening sharp to every sound. The way her hands moved steady despite what she could not see. She was blind, but she was not helpless. That truth unsettled him and eased him at once. When the work ended, they walked back to the cabin. She was quiet, her breath a little heavy but not strained. Cole carried the tools, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the weight of silence pressing down on him. Someone walked beside him, not behind, not pushed away, but beside. Inside, she sat by the fire, threading her fingers over the frayed hem of her dress. Cole realized again how exposed she must have felt, wearing torn fabric that mocked her dignity. Without thinking, he fetched an old shirt of his from the chest. He laid it on the table near her. "It's clean," he said. "Might fit you better." Her hands touched the fabric, tracing the seams. She didn't smile, but her face softened. "Thank you." He nodded and turned away, uneasy at the stir of feeling in his chest. He told himself it was only decency. She was under his roof, and he would not have her treated with shame. Still, when he saw her stand and hold the shirt close, something in him shifted. That evening, after stew and silence, she spoke again. "You didn't answer yesterday. Why did you sign your name?" Cole stared into the fire. The question had been waiting. He hadn't wanted to face it. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe because no one else would. Maybe because I was too slow to say no." She was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "It was enough." Cole looked at her. Her blind eyes faced the fire, her body still. He realized she wasn't asking for promises. She wasn't even asking for kindness. She only wanted not to be abandoned again. That night, he offered her the bed as before, taking the chair for himself. She didn't argue, but when she lay down, her hand brushed the edge of the quilt where his arm had rested the night before. She left it there a second longer than needed, a small gesture, but enough for him to feel it. Cole leaned back in the chair, the fire low, his body tired from the day's work. For the first time in years, he felt the ache of grief shift, not vanish but change shape. He was no longer the only soul in the cabin carrying weight. And in that truth, though unspoken, there was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Snow began to fall 2 days later, thin at first, then heavy enough to cover the ground in a white crust. Cole rose before dawn as he always did, pulling on his boots, his breath showing in the cold cabin air. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. He fed it wood before stepping outside, his shoulders hunched against the bite of the wind. The sky was pale and low, the horizon blurred where land and storm met. Ayoka was awake when he came back in, sitting at the table with her hands folded on her lap. She had changed into the shirt he had given her, the hem long enough to fall almost to her knees. The sleeves were rolled at her wrists where the fabric hung loose. Her blind eyes turned toward him when the door closed, as if she knew the sound of his steps already. "You went out," she said. "Checking the stock," he answered. "Snow's coming heavy." She nodded faintly, her face calm, though her fingers twisted lightly in the fabric of the shirt. Cole noticed it, her quiet way of showing worry, and set the pot of water on the stove without comment. They ate in silence, but not the same silence as the first day. She had grown more at ease, learning the rhythm of the place, the distance between the stove and the table, the sound of his boots moving from corner to corner. He found himself noticing her small habits, how she always traced the rim of her cup before lifting it, how she leaned her head slightly toward the fire as if she could hear the crackle better than he could. By mid-morning, Cole gathered tools to clear snow from the barn roof before it sagged under the weight. He expected her to stay inside, but she rose when he did, pulling her hair into a loose braid by touch alone. "You don't need to follow me out there," he said, tying his gloves. "You said the roof's heavy," she answered. "I can hand you the nails." He studied her. Snow had started to pile against the window ledge, the wind pressing hard against the boards. She was blind, yes, but she had not faltered once since stepping onto this land. He gave a short nod and held the door open. Outside, the air cut sharp against the skin. Ayoka walked carefully, holding her arms slightly out until she brushed the barn wall, then steadied herself there. Cole climbed the ladder, boots slipping once against the ice, but he held firm. From below, she listened to every hammer strike, calling up when she heard would splinter. Her voice carried steady, calm in the storm. When he finished, he climbed down stiff with cold. She was waiting near the door, her hands pink from the wind, but her expression unchanged. Cole pulled off his gloves and caught her fingers without thinking, rubbing them between his palms to warm them. Her breath caught, though she didn't pull away. For a moment they stood in the snow, his rough hands over hers, heat rising between them while the storm pressed all around. Then he released her, uneasy, and they walked back to the cabin in silence. That evening, after chores, Cole found her seated near the fire, mending the torn hem of her dress with thread she had found in his chest. The beads and shells she had carried were laid out in a careful line, her fingers moving among them with surprising precision. He watched as she strung them back into the fabric, repairing what had once shamed her. "You do that by memory?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. "By touch," she corrected, not looking up. "Every bead tells its place." Cole leaned on the table, studying her. "Does it matter to you?" "That looks right." Her blind eyes lifted toward him, steady. "It matters to me that it's mine." The answer struck him harder than he expected. He realized how little she had been allowed to claim. Mocked in town, torn dress, no choice in where she went. Yet here she was, sewing strength back into what she owned. He nodded once and left her to it, but something in him shifted again. That night, when she rose from the table, her shoulder brushed against him. Neither of them moved at first. Cole felt her warmth through the thin fabric of his shirt she still wore, her body close enough he could smell the faint trace of wood smoke in her hair. She did not step away until she had to. He remained still long after, staring at the fire, unsettled by how natural her nearness had begun to feel. When came time to sleep, he set the blanket on the bed as before. She lay down without question. He took the chair, but before he settled, she spoke. "Why do you sit there?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. It's your bed now, he said. It was yours before. He swallowed. Doesn't matter. Silence stretched, broken only by the fire. Then she said quietly, You don't trust yourself. The words cut sharper than he expected. He stared at her, her blind eyes fixed toward the ceiling. She was not wrong. He feared more than desire. He feared betraying the memory of the woman he had lost. He feared letting anyone close only to lose them again. You should rest, he said finally, his tone rough, meant to end the talk. But when she turned on her side and drew the blanket close, her hand brushed the edge of the quilt again, pausing as if she wanted to reach for him, but stopped short. Cole sat in the chair, fists clenched, his thoughts a storm heavier than the snow outside. As the fire dimmed, he thought about what she had asked, about why he kept the chair instead of lying beside her. He told himself it was honor, respect, decency. But deep down he knew it was fear. Fear of change, fear of losing again, fear of needing someone who might not stay. The snow pressed harder against the walls. The cabin was warm, but Cole felt the cold weight of his own heart and the faint warmth of her presence lying only a few feet away. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day, snow building against the door until Cole had to shoulder it open. White stretched across the land in every direction, erasing fences, trails, and even the familiar dips of the hills. The air was sharp enough to sting his throat when he breathed. He stood on the porch a long moment, watching the flakes swirl heavy, and wondered if it had been a mistake bringing her here. The land could break even a strong man. What would it do to a woman who could not see? Inside, Ayoka sat near the stove, her hands resting lightly on her knees, listening. He knew she was listening because every time the wind screamed against the boards, her head tilted. When he stepped back in, stomping snow from his boots, her blind eyes turned toward him immediately. How bad? She asked. Bad enough, he said, setting his hat on the peg. Won't be riding out anywhere for a while. Her face didn't falter. She only nodded, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. He noticed she had finished sewing beads back into her dress during the night. It lay across the chair, repaired but still marked by its rough past. She wore his shirt again, sleeves rolled, the hem brushing her thighs. For reasons he didn't want to examine, he found it harder to look at her like that than when she had stood in rags. They worked side by side that morning. He split wood and she stacked it, her hands finding each piece with surprising steadiness. She stumbled once near the hearth, her foot catching against the table leg, and he crossed the room in 2 strides. His hand caught her elbow. She steadied, breath sharp, then nodded. I'm fine, she said, but her hand lingered on his arm longer than needed. He didn't move. For a moment the cabin was silent, but for the fire's pop. Her fingers traced lightly along the sleeve of his coat, memorizing its line before she let go. Cole stepped back, unsettled. He told himself it was nothing, yet his chest carried the heat of that small touch the rest of the day. By afternoon, the storm eased, but left the world buried. Cole pulled on his coat and prepared to check the creek that ran near the back pasture. The thaw beneath heavy snow sometimes forced ice loose, and a flood could sweep down without warning. He meant to go alone, but Ayoka rose when he lifted the latch. You can't walk out there blind, he said sharply. Her chin lifted. Then let me hold your arm. Cole hesitated, torn between logic and the quiet pride in her voice. Finally, he extended his arm. Her hand slipped into the crook of his elbow, light but firm. They stepped into the snow together. The wind had calmed, but the land was brutal. Snow reached up to her knees, and more than once she stumbled, gripping him harder. Each time, he steadied her, his arms strong at her waist. She said nothing, but her breaths grew quick, visible in the cold air. When they reached the creek, he bent low to check the ice. Cracks had spread along the edges, water shifting below. He muttered a curse under his breath. It'll break soon. Could sweep the fence posts if we don't brace them. Then we brace them, she said simply. He turned to her, surprised. You don't even know what you're agreeing to. Her clouded eyes faced him, calm but firm. I know work. Tell me what to do. For the next hour, he directed her while he hammered support beams into place. She carried stakes, passed tools, held boards steady with her hands braced strong. The cold bit at both of them, but she never complained. Cole found himself watching her more than the fence. She was blind, but she moved with dignity, refusing pity. That truth pressed into him harder than the wind. When the work was finished, they trudged back toward the cabin. Halfway across the field, her foot slipped on hidden ice. She fell against him hard, her chest pressing into his as he caught her. His arms wrapped around her instinctively, holding her upright. For a moment, neither moved. He felt the heat of her body through the shirt, the curve of her waist under his hand. She was breathing fast, her lips parted as if she might speak, but she stayed silent. Cole held her longer than necessary. His pulse hammered in his ears. Then, with effort, he set her back on her feet. "Careful," he muttered, voice rougher than he meant. Back inside, the cabin's warmth hit them both hard after the cold. She removed the shirt's damp sleeves from her wrists, wringing water from the fabric. He hung his coat, avoiding her eyes, though he knew she couldn't see his anyway. The silence between them felt charged, heavier than before. That evening, while he stirred stew over the fire, she asked softly, "Why do you live alone here?" He froze, the spoon heavy in his hand. The question struck deep. He had avoided telling her, avoided even thinking aloud. But he knew she deserved an answer. "My wife," he said finally. His throat tightened. "She died. Years back. After that, I stayed out here alone." Ayoka was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "And you keep her bed empty to honor her?" He turned, meeting her blind gaze, though she could not return it. "I keep it empty because I don't know how to share it again." Her expression didn't change, but her hands gripped the quilt at her lap. "I'm not her," she said quietly, "but I'm not nothing either." The words struck him harder than he wanted to admit. He looked away, unable to answer. That night, as she lay down, she did not leave her hand trailing on the quilt as before. Instead, when he passed her side of the bed, she reached out and caught his wrist. Her fingers were small, firm. "You fear too much," she said softly. "I fear being cast away. That is worse." Cole stood frozen. He wanted to pull free, to retreat into the silence he knew best. But he didn't. He let her hold him, her blind eyes steady on the darkness, until finally her grip eased and she turned onto her side. He sat in the chair again, his chest heavy, his thoughts louder than the storm outside. She had said what he had not dared think. That grief had bound him as tightly as her blindness bound her. And in that shared truth, the walls he had built around himself began to feel less solid. The fire burned low. He closed his eyes, hearing her breathing. For the first time, he let the thought form clear in his mind. He did not want her gone. The storm broke on the third morning. The snow stopped falling, and the land lay buried in a white stillness that carried no sound except the faint creak of trees under the weight of ice. Cole Merrick stepped outside first, pulling his coat tight, his boots sinking deep with each step. The sky was pale, stretched wide with a weak sun that cast the world in silver light. He drew in the cold air and let it sting his lungs. For the first time in days, he felt the grip of worry ease. At least the worst of the weather had passed. When he returned to the cabin, Ayoka was moving slowly along the table, her hands trailing the wood until she found the bread. She had grown sharper in her movements, memorizing every corner of the small room, every distance from chair to stove. Cole noticed how steady she was now, no longer hesitant the way she had been the first night. "You move like you've lived here longer than a week," he said, setting his gloves near the fire. She turned her blind eyes toward him. "The walls speak. I listen." Her calmness struck him, but he didn't argue. Instead, he set coffee to boil. She listened to the kettle, her hands folded over her lap. After breakfast, she said something he hadn't expected. "You told me of your wife, but you didn't tell me her name." Cole froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He hadn't spoken her name in years, not even aloud to himself. It felt locked in his chest. But Ayoka sat waiting, her blind eyes steady, as if silence was not enough anymore. "Mary," he said finally, his voice rough. Her name was Mary. Ayoka nodded once, her expression unreadable. "She mattered to you. That doesn't vanish." He stared at her, the truth of her words pulling at him. She had not flinched or acted jealous. She had only given him permission to speak the memory. It unsettled him, and for a long moment he couldn't find words. That afternoon, Cole set out to dig paths through the snow so the animals could be reached. He didn't tell her to stay inside this time. She came with him, holding to his arm until they reached the barn. He set her near the door with a rake, showing her how to pull hay into piles for the cattle. Her hands moved with care, slow at first, then more certain. Cole worked beside her, clearing drifts from the pens. The sun hung low by the time they finished, painting the snow in shades of gold and gray. They stood together by the fence, their breaths heavy, watching steam rise from the horses' backs. Cole felt something ease inside him. He wasn't alone in the work anymore. He glanced at Ayoka. Her face lifted toward the sun, though her eyes saw none of it. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks red from the cold, and yet she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she always did. Back inside, the cabin filled with warmth from the fire. Cole cooked stew while she mended the last tears in her dress. He watched her fingers move along the fabric, steady and sure, sewing each bead back into place. He thought of the jeers in town, the way men had laughed at her. Here she sat, building her dignity back with her own hands. When supper was done, they ate in silence. But this silence was no longer empty. It carried weight. Every clink of the spoon, every breath, every shift of her hand across the table felt like something unspoken. After the dishes were cleared, Ayoka sat near the fire, her hands resting in her lap. Cole sat across from her, leaning on his knees. He found himself staring at her, at the line of her face, the curve of her shoulders under the shirt she still wore. He told himself to look away, but he couldn't. "You watch me," she said suddenly, her voice calm. He stiffened. "I didn't mean to." Her blind eyes turned toward him, and for once there was no distance in them. "I feel it. It doesn't frighten me." The words caught him off guard. He swallowed, his throat dry. He had lived years in silence, carrying grief like a wound that never healed. Now this woman, unwanted by all others, sat across from him and told him she did not fear his gaze. He felt his chest tighten, not from pain but from something far more dangerous, need. He stood abruptly, pacing once to the table and back. She didn't move. She only listened, calm, steady, her head tilted slightly. Finally, he stopped in front of her. "Ayoka," he said quietly. "Yes." He hesitated, then crouched down so they were level. He lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to stop him. She didn't. His rough palm brushed her cheek, the warmth of her skin startling against the calluses. Her breath caught, but she did not turn away. Instead, she lifted her own hand, sliding it over his jaw. Her fingers traced the scar there, soft but deliberate. Cole closed his eyes. It had been years since anyone had touched him with such care. His pulse hammered in his ears. He leaned closer, slow, uncertain, until his lips brushed hers. The kiss was steady, restrained, nothing rushed. She answered it, her lips soft, her hand still firm against his jaw. When they parted, she whispered, "You're not alone, Cole Merrick." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. Her eyes were blind, but her expression was clear. She had chosen him, not out of desperation, but out of quiet certainty. He felt something shift deep inside him, as if the grief he had carried had made room for something else. He rose, his chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. "You should rest," he said, though his voice shook. She lay down as she had before, but this time when he turned to the chair, she reached out and caught his hand. Her fingers curled around his, firm. She didn't let go until he sat on the edge of the bed. He stayed there a long while, her hand in his, the fire crackling low. For the first time since Mary's death, he didn't feel the crushing weight of the past. The cabin was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. The days that followed the storm were brighter, though bitter cold lingered. Snowdrift still pressed high against the fence line, but the sky stretched clear, and the sun cast long shadows across the white fields. Cole Merrick rose each morning with a new rhythm, no longer a man who worked and ate alone, but someone who listened for another person's steps in the cabin. Ayoka's presence had woven into his routine so quickly that he wondered how he had endured the silence before. On the third day, trouble came. He saw the dust trail long before he heard the hoofbeats. 3 riders crested the hill from the direction of town, their silhouettes sharp against the pale horizon. Cole narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. He hadn't invited company in years, and he knew what kind of talk followed him since the day in Red Rock Ridge. He stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting against the rail though not raised. Ayoka came to the door behind him, her hand brushing the frame. Her blind eyes turned toward the sound of hoofs. She didn't ask who it was. She seemed to already know. The men pulled up near the corral, their horses snorting steam into the cold. One of them, a wiry man with a crooked hat, spat into the snow. "Heard you took yourself a squaw," he said loud, voice mocking. Blind one at that. Cole's jaw flexed. He didn't answer. Silence was his weapon, the one that unsettled men more than threats. The second rider leaned on his saddle horn. "Ain't right, Merrick. You signing papers like that?" "Folks in town been talking." Cole's voice came low, steady. "Town's got nothing to say about what happens on my land." The first man laughed. "Your land? Or hers? You think she's fit to work it? Blind as a bat. Best send her back before she costs you." Ayoka stood in the doorway, her hands curling into the wood. She said nothing, but Cole could feel her tension in the still air. He stepped down off the porch, boots sinking in the snow, closing the distance until he stood eye to eye with the lead rider. "She stays," Cole said flatly. The laughter cut short. The men shifted in their saddles. One muttered something under his breath, but Cole's steady stare silenced him. After a long moment, the first rider spat again and tugged his reins. "You mistake, Merrick. Don't say we didn't warn you." They turned their horses and rode back the way they had come, dust rising against the snow. Cole stood in the cold until they vanished over the ridge. Only then did he turn back toward the porch. Inside, Ayoka waited by the fire. Her blind eyes turned to him the moment he stepped in. "They hate me," she said quietly. "They hate what they don't understand," Cole answered. He set the shotgun aside. She pressed her lips together, then asked the question that had hung in the air for days. "Do you hate it too?" "That I can't see." Cole froze. His chest tightened. He crossed the room slowly, crouched in front of her. "No," he said firmly. "I don't." Her hand lifted, searching. He caught it, pressed it against his chest where his heart beat hard. "I see enough," he said, voice low. "Enough to know I don't want you gone." Her fingers curled into his shirt, trembling faintly. For the first time since she had arrived, her guarded expression broke. Her shoulders loosened, and her blind eyes softened. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. That evening, they ate in quiet, but the silence was different, filled not with uncertainty, but with the weight of a choice made clear. When Cole rose from the table, Ayoka reached for his hand, not searching this time, but certain. He let her hold it, guiding her toward the bed. She lay down as before, but when he turned toward the chair, she tugged lightly. "Not tonight," she said, her voice firm though quiet. Cole stood still, the old fear rising in him. He thought of Mary, of the empty nights that had stretched into years. But Ayoka's hand was warm, insistent. Slowly, he sat on the edge of the bed. She shifted closer, her head finding his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart again. He stayed there, stiff at first, then slowly allowing his arm to curl around her. Her breathing steadied, her body relaxed against his. He stared into the fire until the flames blurred, his chest heavy but no longer hollow. When dawn came, the cabin was the same as it had always been. Boards creaking, wind pressing, fire smoking in the stove. But something had changed. Cole hadn't spent the night in the chair, and Ayoka hadn't slept alone. The next morning, Cole Merrick woke with a weight against his shoulder. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Years had passed since he had opened his eyes to find anyone near. But Ayoka lay curled lightly against him, her head resting where his arm had been, her hair spilling across the quilt. Her blind eyes were closed, her breathing steady. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold, but he didn't move. He stayed still, taking in the strange comfort of not being alone. When she stirred, she shifted back quickly, almost as if she feared she had crossed a line. Her face gave little away, but her fingers tightened on the blanket. Cole sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He wanted to tell her she hadn't done wrong, but the words felt clumsy in his throat. Instead, he pulled on his boots and said gruffly, "I'll see to the stock." Ayoka nodded, her blind eyes lowering. He could see she was uncertain. It made him curse himself for not saying more. But words never came easy for him. Outside, the snow had hardened under the night's cold, crunching beneath his boots as he moved to the barn. The animals were restless, their breath steaming in the dim light. He worked quietly, feeding and checking them, his thoughts circling the same point. What it meant to share a bed again, what it meant to allow someone into a place he had walled off for so long. When he returned, Ayoka was waiting with coffee already poured. She had found her way through the small space with the ease of someone who had memorized every inch. She held out the cup toward him without hesitation, and for the first time he noticed how certain her movements had become. She had claimed the cabin as her own as much as he had. "Thank you," he said, softer than usual. Her lips lifted faintly, and for once, she looked less guarded. That day, they worked together, clearing the paths again. Ayoka insisted on helping, holding to his arm as they walked the fences, carrying tools, steadying boards when he repaired the damage from the snowstorm. She asked questions in her quiet way. How many cattle he kept, how far the land stretched, how long he had lived here. Cole answered each with blunt truth. He had never shared details with anyone in town, but with her, the words came easier, maybe because she didn't push or judge. At midday, they returned to the cabin, both of them tired from a cold. Ayoka moved to the stove, feeling for the pot, stirring stew with slow but certain motions. Cole watched her, uneasy at how natural it felt to stand back and let someone else tend the fire. For years, he had done everything himself. Now she moved there as though it belonged to her too. When they sat to eat, Ayoka asked a question that hung heavier than the others. "The men who came yesterday, will they return?" Cole looked up from his bowl, meeting her blind gaze. "Maybe, but if they do, I'll deal with them." "You're one man," she said quietly. "I've been one man a long time." She tilted her head, listening to the edge in his voice. Then she asked the harder thing. "Would you send me away if it kept trouble from your door?" The question cut straight through him. He set down his spoon and leaned back. "No," he said firmly. "Not now." Her lips pressed together, and she nodded faintly. That was all, but he could see the relief in the way her shoulders eased. She had needed to hear it said aloud, and he realized he had needed to say it. Later, as dusk fell, they sat together near the fire. The silence was thick, but not heavy. Ayoka's hand brushed his arm once, deliberate this time, not by accident. She left it there, waiting. Cole turned his hand slowly, covering hers with his own. She did not flinch. "You're not unwanted here," he said, his voice low. Her blind eyes lifted toward him. "Then let me stay in truth. Not because of a paper. Not because no one else would." He swallowed, the firelight throwing shadows across his scarred face. "I want you here," he admitted, the words rough but honest. She reached up then, her fingers finding his jaw, tracing the line of his scar. He leaned closer, his lips brushing hers again. This time the kiss deepened, no longer tentative but sure, carrying all the weight of what they hadn't spoken. Her hand slid to his chest, her palm steady against the beat of his heart. When they pulled apart, she didn't release him. "I can't see you," she whispered, "but I feel you." "That's enough." Cole's throat tightened. He had been afraid of this, afraid of letting someone in, but now the fear felt different. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of how much he needed her. That night, when they lay down, there was no chair, no distance. He stretched beside her, stiff at first, then slowly allowing himself to relax. She nestled against him, her head beneath his chin, her hand still resting on his chest. He closed his eyes, listening to her breathing, feeling the weight of her presence. For the first time in years, the bed felt like a place of life, not memory. As sleep pulled at him, he thought of what the men from town might say, of how neighbors might sneer if word spread. But then he thought of her, blind and unwanted by all of them, yet steady at his side. The choice was clear. Let them talk. She stayed. The thaw came slow that year. By March, the snow had melted into thick mud, and the creek ran heavy with broken ice. Cole Merrick worked the pastures daily, his shoulders bent against the wind, while Ayoka kept close to the cabin, learning every new corner of the land through sound, touch, and her growing memory. She had walked the same paths so many times that she knew each step, each fence post, each rise of earth beneath her boots. Cole noticed it. He watched her confidence grow, and with it, his unease shifted into something else, pride. She was no burden. The townsfolk who mocked her would never understand that. Still, he knew it was only a matter of time before Red Rock Ridge made its noise again. He was right. One afternoon, as he hauled sacks of feed from the barn, he saw riders on the ridge. Two of the same men who had come weeks before, this time with a third. They rode straight down the slope, snow and mud splattering beneath hooves, and stopped short of his fence. Cole rested the feed sack against the rail, his pale blue eyes steady. "You still keeping her?" the wiry one called, spitting to the side. "Blind one's not fit for ranch life. Word is you're touched in the head for trying." Cole didn't move. Ayoka had come out onto the porch, her hands on the post, listening. He could feel her tension, though she said nothing. The broad-shouldered rider leaned forward on his reins. "Town's talking about making it official. Says she can't be bound to you. Paper or not, no court would honor it." Cole stepped closer, his boots heavy in the mud. "That paper signed," he said flatly, "and she's mine. That's the end of it." The men laughed, but there was no ease in the sound. They shifted in their saddles, uneasy under the weight of his stare. Cole's hand rested near his revolver, though he didn't lift it. Finally, the wiry man shook his head and pulled his horse around. "Suit yourself, Merrick. Don't expect help when she drags you down." They rode off, dust and mud rising behind them. Cole stood watching until they vanished. Then he turned back toward the porch. Ayoka was still there, her blind eyes facing him, her hands gripping the rail. "You'd fight the whole town for me," she said softly. "If I had to," he answered, climbing the steps. "Why?" He stopped in front of her, his jaw tight. "Because I want you here. Because you matter. Because I'd rather fight them all than go back to an empty house." Her lips trembled, though her voice stayed steady. "Then I'm not a burden." "No," he said firmly. "Never." Inside, the fire burned steady. That evening, Cole and Ayoka sat together at the table. She reached across, finding his hand without hesitation now. Her fingers laced with his, warm and sure. "I was left in the dust before," she said quietly. "Men mocked me, called me cursed. Even my father sent me away. I thought I would always be nothing." Cole gripped her hand tighter. "You're not nothing. You're here, with me. That's all that matters." She tilted her head toward him, her blind eyes soft. "Then tell me plain. Will I stay here, not as a guest, not as someone you pity, but as your wife?" The words hit him square. He had not spoken the thought aloud, though it had circled him for weeks. He remembered Mary, remembered the grave by the cottonwoods, remembered the years of silence. For a long moment, fear tugged at him, the fear of losing again. But when he looked at Ayoka, at her strength, her quiet defiance against a world that had cast her aside, he felt the weight shift. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "As my wife." She exhaled slowly, relief breaking across her face. Her hand traced up to his jaw, lingering over the scar. "Then I will stay. Always." That night, they lay together not as strangers tied by paper, not as survivors clinging through winter, but as two people who had chosen each other. Cole's arm curved around her, holding her close, while her head rested on his chest. For the first time in years, he felt peace settle deep inside him. The grief that had ruled him did not vanish, but it no longer owned him. Ayoka's presence filled the cabin with something stronger than memory, life. Weeks later, spring came. The land thawed, grass pushing green across the fields. Cole worked the cattle, Ayoka walking the fence lines with sure steps, her hand brushing each post as she passed. Together they planted seed, mended the barn roof, and kept the fire burning at night. The cabin, once hollow, grew full. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Cole carved a new marker from oak. He set it in the yard near the porch. On one side was Mary's name, still honored. On the other, he carved Ayoka's, steady and deliberate. When she traced the letters with her fingers, her blind eyes softened. Two names, she whispered. Both seen. Both loved, Cole said quietly. She turned her face toward him, her lips finding his in the fading light. This kiss was not tentative, not restrained. It was certain, the seal of their choice. From that day forward, the town's talk no longer mattered. Cole and Ayoka lived on their land, side by side. She moved through her blindness with dignity. He carried his scars without shame, and together they built a life that was not loud but steady, not dramatic but true. The cabin was no longer a place of grief. It was their home, and in the stillness of Wyoming, in the shadow of loss and the face of scorn, Cole, Merrick, and Ayoka found the one thing neither thought possible: belonging. They stayed, together, always.